Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20. We see here in Exodus chapter 20 what's called, of course, the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments. And as you know very well, just about a little bit of review, the children of Israel had been in Egypt for quite a number of years. And it was there that Jacob went down to be with Joseph and the brothers as well. And there they prospered in the land of Goshen. But as you know, as they grew in number, that Pharaoh arose that did not know Joseph, did not know the legend of Joseph, and did not honor that. And so he saw this great host of people among him and said, well, if they ally with our enemies, then they could be an enemy within us. And so he enslaved them for a great number of years. And as you know, Moses was chosen by God on Mount Sinai at the burning bush to go and to bring his people out. Moses had been born in Egypt, as you know. And you know the story of how Pharaoh's daughter found him and raised him in the courts of Pharaoh. At 40 years old, he had killed an Egyptian and had to flee. And then he worked for Jethro when he married there for 40 years. And about 80 years old, believe it or not, he's at the burning bush. And so, with some reluctance, Moses went along with his brother Aaron to bring them out of Egypt. And it was that point that God performed miracles through Moses, and we know of the 10 plagues that came about because of that. And he brought them out, as God said, by a mighty hand. Brought them, parted the Red Sea, brought them over to Mount Sinai, the mountain of God, which was about, after they left Egypt, about 50 days or so after that. And when you look at all that, you've got this great mass of people here who really have, in a sense, no direction as far as understanding who they are as a people. They had been slaves for many, many years. They had acquiesced to the Egyptians. They had obeyed the Egyptians. They had been under Egyptian law and so forth. And actually, the slaves in Egypt had a law unto themselves that the Egyptians put on them. And the Egyptians had a law, if you will, that they saw for one another, and even Pharaoh and the royal house had their own law. And so there was a hierarchy of law, and with the Israelites at the bottom. And so once they came out of Egypt, they had to figure out, well, what laws do we follow, right? I mean, how do we treat each other? What do we do? I mean, we're out here and there's no, quote, there's God, but how do we met out law? How do we treat one another? How do we do this, in other words? And so you basically need three things to have a nation, as you know. You need a people, you need a law, and you need a land, right? So you've got the people, they're heading towards the land, but you need a law, right? And so what God does here in Exodus chapter 20, he gives them the basis of the law that he's going to met out for them in order for them to follow to be the nation that they need to be. The Ten Commandments. This is the basis. Of course, there's 600-something statutes that come later on, but this is the basis, if you will, of what he wants them to be. This is what my people need to be. This is what my people need to observe. And this is the way my people need to treat me, and this is the way my people need to treat each other. So that's why at the base of Sinai, it's God himself. The cloud and the pillar of smoke is on Mount Sinai. Moses is between the pillar of cloud and smoke and the people. Now there's thunders and flashings, and what's happening is Moses is interpreting to the people what God is saying at this point. And it's God himself in his voice that thunders down these 10 commandments. It's after this where the people say, we don't want to hear from God. He scares us to death. You tell us, Moses. And it was from that point forward where Moses he goes up and he brings down the statutes and so forth. They didn't want to hear these thunderings like because it scared them to death. God actually spoke these 10 commandments. Can you imagine? I just can't imagine being there when God is speaking these 10 commandments down from the mountain, that all these 1.5 million people could hear him saying, and Moses interpreting, if you will, for the people what God was saying. And so when you look at these 10 commandments, you could really say that the majority of the nations on the earth, even today, even if they don't realize it, base their laws on these 10 commandments, or at least many of them. That you could go around the globe, whether it be the United States or Great Britain or India or Mexico or wherever it may be, all these here have a reiteration of some way the 10 commandments. If you go to the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., you know there's that arch that goes, there's this columns and there's this roof that you go into the Supreme Court. Right in the very center is a depiction of Moses holding the 10 commandments above the Supreme Court building. If you haven't noticed that. But he's right there in the very center, he's holding the 10 commandments at the Supreme Court building that's etched into that. And behind the Supreme Court, believe it or not, behind the Supreme Court justices is "In God We Trust." Now, do they always do that? No. But we have that there. Moses he's etched there holding the 10 commandments as you go into the Supreme Court building. "In God We Trust" is behind the justices there. And so as we look at this, we can take this to heart. That this is basically how God wants us to treat one another and treat Him. And so we see here the first commandment. We talked about this last week. The first commandment, "You shall have no other gods before me." Now this is whether in addition to or in preference to the one true God. What gods do we set up today is the question. We're to have no other gods before Him. What gods do we set up today? Well, it could be the God of self, right? I'm the center of the universe. I'm all important and I'm going to get what I can. Don't matter what I have to treat you, I'm going to do what I have to do. Maybe our God is money. That we're the pursuit of wealth and all of these other things at the behest of our own soul, as you will. And we could list a lot of things. Maybe there's some sin that we like to indulge in order to pleasure ourselves. Or maybe we like to gamble, if you will, or whatever, and takes it to the extreme of just becoming this great sin that's in our lives. A lot of things can be a god in our lives. In Egypt, there were many gods. And many people of Israel worshiped those gods. And if you look at the plagues, as we talked a little bit about last week, every plague was an attack on some Egyptian god that they revered. They weren't really gods. They were just stone and gold and so forth, but you know what I'm talking about here. He said, don't set any other gods up. He doesn't want any nation to set up gods other than Him, because there is no other gods, really. Only God Himself. To worship other gods set up by men is to deny our divine heritage and creation. And so He wanted them to understand that they needed to be unique people. They didn't need to be like the Egyptians to have these pantheon of gods. That they needed to serve the one true God. Unfortunately, later on as they go into the land, they began to adopt those gods of that land, unfortunately. But they weren't supposed to do that. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 5 and 6, "For even if there are so-called gods and many lords, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords," that people believe in, that is, "yet for us there is but one God, the Father." One. Even though Paul's talking Corinthian brethren, they've got in Corinth, there's this plethora of temples that are there and shrines to these various gods that aren't really gods. Even though he says they believe in all these things, you believe in one God, and that's true. And that's what you should do. That's whether for the nation, church, or individual. And so to build this nation, they had to have a firm foundation, and the foundation was going to be to the one true God. And then he says here in verse 4, "You shall not make for yourself an idol or of any likeness of creation." An idol or graven image. The word graven there means to engrave or impress or mark. It's to make with hammer and with tools, if you will, to graven them into that. They're not to make an idol of any likeness of heaven, earth, or water. It's interesting to note that there are no ancient idols found of the likeness of God. Now there are representations of God like the golden calves that Jeroboam put up and what Aaron's going to do here later on. This is the God that brought you out of Egypt. But there's no ancient idols that depict God Himself, which is a good thing, right? because you're not supposed to do that. And so God is a jealous God, as we talked about last week. This is righteous indignation. This is righteous judgment. This is holiness. This is Him being set apart and sanctified. So the implications of doing this can be felt for generations and generations. Notice here in verse 5. For you shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and the fourth generations of those who hate me. So if you do these things, if you set up these other gods, and you set up these other graven images of these other gods, this affects future generations. You can't build a nation that way in affecting future generations in that way. You can't be like the Egyptians and the Canaanites and whoever else it is. But the one true God, and you can't make any images of these things because you are made in the image of God. And you shouldn't bow down to these images because you are the image of God. Because He has given you a soul. So see, He's trying to build this nation. He's trying to put these people together. He's trying to give them a law. And by the way, it's going to be much different from the Egyptian laws in the fact that all of these laws that God is going to give is going to be equally meted out to everyone, whether you're a king or a slave. Right? Remember back in Egypt, you had different levels of laws for the slave, for the Egyptian, and for the king's house. But here, it's supposed to be like in this country, that the law is applied to everyone, whether you're president or whether you're a factory worker, right? It's supposed to be anyway, right? And so this is what God is talking about here. These laws are for everyone, and to build this nation, you've got to build it under God. On top of that, notice verse 7, the third command. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes His name in vain. So what does it mean by in vain? Well, in vain means to take it in an improper manner or use it in an improper way, if you will, or an undignified way. And actually, the Jews would not even say Yahweh or Jehovah for fear they would use it the wrong way. They would use Father and Lord and other words. They wouldn't even use Yahweh for fear. And so it's more along the lines of don't use the name of His authority in an improper way, in a disrespectful way that would bring His majesty low and cause to sin. So again, we're not to call on God in vain. We're not to speak God's name in vain. We're not to use God's name in vain. God's name must be revered, if you will. It must be held in high, because if you do, all these other two commands come tumbling down. Because if you don't respect God and His name, you're not going to revere Him as the one true God, and you're going to go off with these other gods and make these graven idols and bring Him down to where He ought not be. Make an image of Him, if you will. So don't take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Revelation chapter 4, verses 8 and 9, we see there in the throne scene, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God the Almighty, who was and who is to come. And when the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to Him who sits on the throne, to Him who lives forever and ever. It really bothers me when people use God's name in slang. I'm just like, please don't do that. Don't say though in that way. I'm not even going to repeat it up here, but you know what I'm talking about. And using it in slang or using it in a flippant way or a flippant manner, referring to God, if you will, it's a very dangerous thing to do. And we need to show more respect to the God of heaven in those things. Then in verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. So to have this nation, remember this is an Israelite nation, He's building a nation. He says we're going to have a Sabbath day. Now that was Saturday, of course. That was the last day of the week for them. It was to be a day of holy convocation where they would not practice, if you will, their vocation. In other words, if you were a doctor, you didn't put out your shingle. If you were a carpenter, you didn't go work on a house. If you're a farmer, you didn't go out and harvest your wheat and so forth. And so it was a day of holy convocation. What it was meant to do was to remind people of their sin and their dependence upon God. And so they were to stay at home. They were to have the meal prepared ahead of time and the fire prepared ahead of time. And they were to be in prayer and holy, if you will, convocation unto God. And to remember God at least one day a week, to come together and remember who God is. That He is the one that's given us all these things and that we should give Him the glory, if you will. And so see, He's trying to build this nation unto Him, this holy nation. Because later on He's going to say, I want you to be a kingdom of priests. That's what He says. He wanted all of them. Unfortunately, they failed in that, didn't they? With the golden calf. So He had to turn right around and say, okay, we're just going to do it this way. We're going to separate the Levites to do this and that and so forth. So we've got this special day the nation's going to set aside, and you're going to rest on that day. You know, it's been found that if a person takes just one day of rest a week, they have a more peaceful life. Psychologically. That they have more. If they just take one day or a half day just to do something, they have more peace. At least that's not mean that all people can do that, but just in general, they have a more peaceful life up here, if you will. And then he says here in verse 12, commandment 5 that is. Honor your father and mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you. Honor your father and mother. What does the word honor mean? It means to put them in high esteem. This honor means giving honor to our parents so that the traditions of God can be passed on, because they didn't have printing presses back then. And so how did you learn about God? Well, you could go to the priest and learn about God, but where did you really learn about God and learn about Jesus? Well, not learn about Jesus at this time, but learn about God. Well, you listen to your parents. Tell them on the way. Tell them in the house. Tell them while you're sitting. And so remember, and so forth. Speak to them about God. And so if you didn't listen to your parents about God, then how in the world can you be prolonged in the land if you forget God, right? So that's what it's talking about here. Honor your father and mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God has given you. They'll remember God, and then the traditions will be passed on, and then you'll be serving God from generation to generation, and none of the punishments would have to come upon you that I laid out if you forget me. And so honor what your parents say. God will keep blessing you and keep you in the land if you continue to honor your parents. Now, that doesn't mean every single parent is going to be the greatest parent in the world. Does it? It doesn't. There are a lot of parents that aren't the greatest parents in the world, right? But in general, if you listen to the previous generation about God, that will come into the next generation, and then the next generation, and then the next generation, and God will not be forgotten. You see, He's building a nation here, guys. He's giving them a law. And then in verse 13, he says, thou shalt not kill, or thou shalt not murder there. Now, the word there for kill or murder is R-A-S-A-H, which is in our language rasa in the Hebrew, and it means premeditated murder. That's what it means. It doesn't mean accidental, it doesn't mean an accident, and it doesn't mean slaying like in warfare. That's sahat, S-A-H-A-T. But this murder is premeditated murder. Thou shalt not murder. And of course, the Old Testament makes a distinction between premeditated murder and unintentional killing. An accident, if you will. If you study the laws of the Old Testament or the statutes, if you unintentionally kill somebody, you could go to the cities of refuge, and then trial is brought to met out what exactly happened. And if it was unintentional and it was an accident, then you did not bear the punishment for that because you didn't mean to do that or something happened. Usually a penalty was put in. If it was your animal that did it and so forth, you had to pay back so much money and so forth because it happened. But accidents and so forth. But this is what's called just murdering, because again, It's the idea of we are made in God's image. And what if a person premeditates and murders somebody, he's murdering the image of God. And so you're taking away what God has given this person. You're taking away in that all that he is and all that he ever will be. You take it all in that. He can't even, you've taken everything that he's got by that action. And so don't murder, don't kill. Then in verse 14, the 7th commandment, he says, you shall not commit adultery. Adultery. What is adultery? Well, adultery is sexual relations with someone while you're married. And so we see it specifically. And so if you've got two people here, or a man or a woman who's married, and they go outside the marriage covenant and they have sexual relations with somebody else, that's adultery. That's breaking the marriage covenant, if you will. That's breaking what God has brought together that no man should sunder, if you will. And so the roots, the idea of this is that the idea of family, and that God is the father and the nation is the bride. And if you recall, when Israel went off into these other idols, what did God call it? He called it adultery, because he was the husband and the nation was the bride. Today, Christ is the husband and the church is the bride. And so if the church goes off over after somebody else besides Christ, other teachings, other false doctrines and other things, that's adultery unto Jesus Christ. And so here is the idea of if you don't honor what's here, the husband and wife, how are you going to honor a relationship between God and the nation? If you don't honor this down here, the marriage bed is to be undefiled. In other words, here. And then in verse 15, number 8, you shall not steal. Well, that's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Mm-hmm. You shall not steal. But as we're going to see, that has a little deeper meaning for the Jews. We understand what it means, because later on, what's going to happen is when they take the land, they're going to get an inheritance, right? Each family is going to get it. They're going to get a plot of land. They're going to get a place for their people to live, right? And God is going to bless them with blessings. And so if you steal from that person, what are you doing? You're stealing the blessings of God. Therefore, you're stealing from God. And so stealing is not only stealing from your neighbor, it's stealing from God because of the blessings that they've given them. And so he warns them there not to steal. Every family will have an inheritance. If you steal from your neighbor, you steal from his inheritance and you steal from God. Think about the story of King Ahab and Naboth. You remember Naboth's vineyard was right near where the king was living. And Ahab came up to him and says, I want to buy your vineyard. You remember the story? I want to buy your vineyard. You got a beautiful vineyard here. I tell you what, I'll only buy this vineyard, but I'll find you another one that's probably even better up the road. Remember? And what did Naboth say? I can't sell you my family's inheritance. Remember that every family has an inheritance. I can't sell you my family's inheritance because that's what given to us. That was given to us by God. Well, you know what King Ahab did. Jezebel tricked the elders into thinking that he blasphemed God. Next thing you know, Naboth's dead. The king steps in, unlawfully, by the way. It still was in Naboth's family's inheritance. King Ahab violates God's law, and he steps right in and he claims that, if you will, that vineyard that Naboth had. So he stole from Naboth and his family that inheritance. Commandment number 9, verse 16. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. It means you don't lie in false testimony. You don't lie in false testimony. When we bear false witness, we're not seeking justice. And God is a God of justice, is He not? God is a God of justice. Bearing false witness shows that we do not love our neighbor as we should. Saying false things or making false claims or as a witness lying under oath, if you will, about the things that we have seen. And of course, we know the idea of who your neighbor was hotly debated among the Jewish rabbis. Who is your neighbor? Who is your neighbor? Jesus ended that debate with the Good Samaritan. Because you remember when the Pharisee came to him and asked him the question. And then he says, well, then who is your neighbor? And Jesus said, let me tell you a story about a man, a Samaritan who traveled from Jericho to Jerusalem. And he gave him that lesson on who's your neighbor. Well, anybody in need. That's your neighbor. That's your neighbor. And so we see here, as Paul said in Ephesians 4 and verse 25, therefore laying aside falsehood, speak truth each one of you with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. We are members of one another. So see, he's building a nation, right? This is the foundation. Don't have any other gods before me. Have one God, if you will. Don't take my name lightly. Set aside a day to honor me. Honor your father and your mother. Make sure you keep the traditions. Treat each other right. Don't murder. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. Don't bear false witness. And then number 10, don't covet. Don't covet. You should not, verse 17, you should not covet your neighbor's house. You should not covet your neighbor's wife or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. In other words, if you're going down the road and you see this palatial mansion on the hill up there that this person has, you know, he's got all these servants, if you will, you're not to envy that. You're not to covet that. You could say, oh, that's a pretty house. Nothing wrong with that. But don't covet it. Don't say, I desire that and he doesn't deserve it. I desire that and I want it, and why did God give him that and not give me that? That's the coveting aspect of it. To covet means to fix a desire for, to long for, to reach after, and to desire to have more, irregardless of the blessings you already have. Now, there's nothing wrong with setting goals and trying to do better. But moving forward in those things means that the things that you have, you appreciate right in the moment. And you don't long for something else that you don't have that makes you miserable in the moment. A lot of people live their lives and they wish we had this. I'd be happier if I had this. I'd be happier if I had that. I'd be happier if this was happening in my life. No, you wouldn't. Once you attain it, you'd be looking at something else. No, you wouldn't. There's something, oh, that'll make me happier right over there. I'm going to go right over here and do that. And you attain that, and then that's not going to be satisfied. That's what coveting does. You have to be satisfied with what you got because God gave you those blessings. And then go towards those goals, sure, but don't make those goals your happiness, because your happiness should be in the day. It should be happy right now. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5 tells us, let your conversation be without covetousness, to be content with such things as you have. For he hath said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. The bottom line to not coveting is knowing the Lord is with us always. That's the bottom line to not coveting. Now, does that mean we're not going to face hard times? Of course we will. Does that mean we're not going to face a bumpy road? Of course we're going to face a bumpy road. We're going to have times when we are in need, if you will, from time to time. But even in those situations, we base our happiness on the Lord with us daily. That He's always looking over us in those things. You see, He's trying to build a nation, guys, here. They needed a law. They needed to know how to treat God. They needed to know how to honor their father and mother and keep that generation's teachings going. And they needed to know how to treat one another. Remember, there were slaves in Egypt under laws that were much different than what the Egyptians, if you will, observed. They didn't have any rights there. They were virtually slaves. They had very few, if any, rights. But they needed to learn how to treat one another and to police one another, if you will, so they could be the nation that God wanted them to be. I think that if we look at these commandments, at least the majority of them here, we can say that if I go by these things that the New Testament says I need to do, then my life would be better. If a nation went by those things, the nation would be better. Church goes by those things, the church would be better. These are all things that show that man has dignity and should have dignity towards one another. So I hope this has been helpful tonight for a little while. If there's anybody here tonight who needs anything in their lives, please come to stand and sing this song.